Hello everyone, welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm Amanda and I work with adult formation at St. Joseph Parish. Today I have the privilege of introducing our topic and special guest, Mr. Philip Campbell. The religious landscape of the United States is about 70% Christian, but only around 20% identify as Catholic. Despite the centuries separating us from the Reformation, you all have some familiarity of its impact on our lives today. Perhaps the most enduring theme of your concerns is how challenging it is to live out your faith as a Catholic in the United States. St. John of the Cross, one of the great saints of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, recognized what we're feeling when he said, "Strive to preserve your heart in peace. Let no event of this world disturb it." Philip Campbell is an author and educator. He holds a bachelor's degree in European history from Ave Maria University and a teaching certificate from Madonna University. Of particular relevance to this talk, Mr. Campbell wrote Heroes and Heretics of the Reformation, and the fourth volume of his Story of Civilization is on the history of the United States. He teaches for Homeschool Connections, where the catalog contains no fewer than 40 courses that he's created and taught over more than 15 years. Many of them relevant to the topics that he'll be discussing tonight. When I first met Philip in a college classroom where we were students, I was struck by how passionate he was about the content and how interesting many of the things were that he had to say. I know that you're going to observe the same thing yourself this evening. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Philip Campbell.
Thank you very much. What a nice welcome. And I especially want to greet those of you who came to the last talk that we did back in May. That was a real good time. That was my first time here meeting many of you. And so welcome back. Especially you young people who came out. You're going to be really bored during this talk. So thanks. I really appreciate that. I have a table set up over there with my books. I'll mention those at the end of the talk, and I'll be sticking around afterwards to chit-chat, or if anybody wants to pick up some books, I'll be around. What an interesting thing it is being Catholic in the United States. We pay the same taxes and drive on the same roads and vote in the same elections as our non-Catholic countrymen, but nevertheless, at times, there's this sense that our values, specifically as Catholics, don't necessarily align with the values of the country at large. And then conversely, we are often unaware of the way that our own assumptions have been shaped by growing up in a culture that historically is Protestant dominated. I personally really started thinking about this issue when I was in Austria for college back in 2003. And I was doing a semester there, and I'm outside, and I see this kid who must have been 12 years old carrying a 12-pack of beer home from the store. And he's just walking down the road carrying a bunch of alcohol. And that just made my mind freak out, because obviously, that doesn't fly over here in the States. So I asked around people that live there, isn't that illegal? And they're like, no, that's not illegal. The parents send the kid to the store to buy alcohol all the time. There's no rules about that. And I just couldn't fathom it. And I started digging into it, and it's really, the reason it's so different in our country is because of our Puritan background, where our country was founded by Puritans who took the approach that drinking alcohol is sinful, it needs to be avoided. And our country developed with like a taboo around alcohol, where it was always something that had to take place in like dark bars and taverns where immoral things happen, and we had to keep kids away from it. And of course, the kids that makes them want it more, right? When you tell them they can't have it. But in Austria, they didn't have any of these problems. I said, do they have like a childhood drunkenness epidemic? No. They because anybody can access the alcohol, it's just ho-hum. It's not a big deal. The kids aren't eager to go get drunk every weekend. And it made me start thinking how, is there other ways that our Protestant legacy in this country has continued to affect the way that we, the different attitudes we have as a culture? So that's what this talk is going to be about. It's going to be about ways that Protestantism has affected and continues to affect certain aspects of American life. So, as Amanda so eloquently stated, the Reformation was a long time ago. It was a big deal, and few epochs are as consequential in church history as the Protestant Reformation, or as we Catholics like to say, the Protestant Revolt or the Protestant Rebellion, from our perspective. Beginning in 1517 and lasting for well over a century, the Reformation was like a civil war amongst Christians in Western Europe. Now, the issues that sparked the Reformation were primarily religious, but the Reformation itself became something much bigger. It spilled over into every aspect of society: national identity, patterns of land ownership, economics, the place of religion in civic life, and even the role and legitimacy of the government were all kind of fought over during the Reformation. The struggles of that century actually gave rise to the nation state. Like, that's what brought us out of the feudal era into the modern era. So it even affected patterns of settlement in the New World. Was traced by the Reformation. So it's a full-scale transformation of all the structures of power across the Christian world. So we'd be wrong to look at the Reformation and say, oh, this is just a religious argument that people had 500 years ago. It was way more than that. It was a dispute about the nature of our entire civilization. There's a 20th century French historian that I like named Jacques Barzun, who said that he went so far as to say that our entire society today was birthed in the fires of the Reformation. Now, I personally think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but even so, it demonstrates how profoundly the Reformation has affected Western society since that time. And this is extremely important when we consider American history, because the United States, of course, did not develop in a vacuum. It came out of emerged from Protestantism. And this is a point we often miss, because we all know from when we studied civics, the First Amendment, there's no official state religion, there's separation of church and state, right? The government is officially non-confessional, but we tend to overlook the immense cultural influence that Protestantism has had in the development of the U.S. So consider the following. Number one, population. At the time of the American Revolution, 98% of the people in this country identified as Protestants. Only 2% identified as Catholics. That's about 70,000 Catholics in a country of 2.5 million. So just in terms of the raw demographics, we were an overwhelmingly Protestant country. Now, second, there's the issue of intent. On the eve of the Reformation, every one of the 13 colonies had anti-Catholic legislation on the books, ranging from prohibiting Catholics from participating in the government to denying religious liberty, banning priests from the colonies, and so on. Even the most tolerant colony, Pennsylvania, had laws stating that no one could hold even the most petty office in the colony unless they took an oath denying the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. And that was in the most tolerant colony. Then you had places like Massachusetts where they literally banned Christmas and forced you to work on Christmas Day just so you couldn't secretly celebrate it. This law, by the way, in Pennsylvania was enforced from 1693 right to the founding of the United States. Now, what's interesting is that anti-Catholic legislation even continued after the United States was founded, even after the Revolution. In the 1780s in New York, the Anti-Federalists passed legislation barring Catholics from political office, and they almost succeeded in taking away the franchise from Catholics entirely in the state of New York. Now, even if not all states resorted to such measures, it's nevertheless clear that the intention of the first generations of Americans was to maintain the United States as a culturally Protestant entity. Most of us are probably aware of the anti-Irish bias, the anti-Italian bias in earlier generations. Part of that bias was because Irish and Italians are Catholic, and the Protestant population feared a Catholic takeover of the country. So this persisted into the anti-Catholic school legislation of the 1880s, the lingering anti-Catholicism of the 1920s. Our first Catholic presidential candidate, Democrat Al Smith, had his campaign tanked when, due to anti-Catholic bias and rumors that he was going to construct a tunnel under the Atlantic to connect the White House to the Vatican. I'm not even joking. That was the... Conspiracy theories aren't a modern thing, necessarily. Wow. Dude, that'd be cool, though. Campaign on build the tunnel. Yeah. As late as 1960, the American press was grilling JFK on whether an American president could be a faithful Catholic without violating his allegiance to the United States Constitution due to a Catholic's loyalty to the Pope. So finally, there's also the issue of precedent. The Founding Fathers looked directly to the conflicts of the Reformation as the precedent for seceding from Great Britain. Where did the Founding Fathers get the idea to revolt? Were they just like, we're going to have a revolution? Like, this was the first time we'd established a democracy. The United States was the first modern democracy. Did they just come up with that out of the blue? No, they were looking back to an earlier conflict called the Glorious Revolution, which happened in 1688 at the close of the Reformation. This was a coup in England that saw the Protestant nobility overthrow the last Catholic king of England, James II. And this provided the framework for how the Founding Fathers understood the American Revolution. If you look at the documents like the Declaration of Independence, it borrows language directly from the Protestant nobles' protests against James II, almost verbatim. So a Reformation conflict was the immediate precedent for the revolution upon which our country was created. So, obviously, though, so what? That's old history. But obviously, Americans today, most of us, are no longer enmeshed in the theological or political controversies of the 1500s, right? Except for me, because here I am talking about them. But the United States is obviously far more diverse now than it's ever been. But still, ideas have family trees, and even if the landscape has changed dramatically, many of the assumptions and attitudes we hold today have developed directly out of the Reformation. So in this talk, I'm going to be highlighting several ways that the Reformation continues to affect the United States, especially in our cultural attitudes. And as you will see, they touch on every aspect of our lives, our politics, economics, how we perceive our country, and our place in the world. It's just in the air from growing up in the culture here, and there's really no way to get away from it. But one disclaimer before we begin. As I go and point out these concepts, which I believe derive from the Reformation, that doesn't mean they're entirely bad or that I'm condemning them, much less suggesting you should condemn them. So I'm not interested in passing judgment on these aspects of our culture. We're just tracing their ideological lineage. We're doing a family tree study of where these ideas come from. So we're looking at our national family tree and asking, who's your daddy? We're not worried about if he's a good man or not. We're just trying to find out where these ideas come from. So this talk isn't meant to persuade you of any position. But I do hope it challenges us all to think more reflectively about the way we perceive ourselves, and probably will be challenged. You probably will be challenged by some of the connections that I draw. Second thing, if you need to fall asleep, go ahead. I know it's dinner time and you're digesting food and you came out of Mass. I won't be offended. I'll just think, wow, my voice must be so soothing to put these people to sleep. That's a compliment. So when the Protestant John Calvin fled France for Geneva in 1536, he was given authority by the city fathers of Geneva to set up a godly society in the Swiss town. Calvinist Geneva would be an entirely theocratic city, ruled by a religious body called the consistory. The function of the consistory was to fuse religious law and civil law together, enforcing Calvinist theology with the force of the law. It was Calvin's chance to start afresh, to build society from the ground up, to wipe the slate clean of all the baggage of Catholicism and the French monarchy, and to construct a godly order from the ground up. It sounds a little utopian. There's always been a strain of utopianism in the Protestant world, and it gets more intense the further away you go from Catholicism. Has anybody ever heard of the Anabaptists? The Anabaptists were radicals who in 1534 seized the German city of Münster, and they were fired up by this apocalyptic utopianism. After taking the city, they proclaimed a divinely sanctioned communism, including the sharing of wives and wealth and property. while they waited for the New Jerusalem to descend upon them from heaven. Now, their coup failed, and they suffered the fate that most people in the 1500s suffered after trying something like that. And the cages that held their corpses are still hanging from the spire of St. Lambert's Church in Munster. But the heirs of the Anabaptists today are the Amish and the Mennonites, who still in their own, in a certain sense, are still seeking to build like a little godly order in their own close-knit little communities. Now, most Protestants didn't take it that far. The Calvinists had a utopian bent as well, though more modest. This was inherited from Calvin himself, and it would be a model for other Calvinists. Wherever they congregated, the Calvinists wanted to replicate the godly experiment of the city of Geneva, which they called the community of saints. So if we go to England, the Calvinists in England were known as Puritans or separatists. Puritans because they wanted a pure church, purified of all the Catholic elements in the church, and a pure society. Sometimes they were called separatists because they wanted to separate from the Church of England. Now, think about this. You're a Puritan, you're living in England in the years after the Reformation, and you want to build a godly society without the baggage of the old world, and you're looking across the sea to the new world, and this represents a profound opportunity to realize your vision. With its vast wildernesses untouched by the hand of civilization, the American continent offered a once-in-a-lifetime chance to build a godly society in the new land on a fresh foundation, untainted by any of the corruption of the old world. So this was the ideal the Puritans carried with them when they founded Plymouth, Boston, and the other colonies of New England. John Winthrop, one of Massachusetts' early colonial governors, had a famous saying that these colonies were meant to be a shining city on a hill. This is the idea that the American colonies are a special place where God is honored and which God has blessed. The old world is corrupt and sinful, but here we do it right. We are a shining example, a beacon of godliness and liberty to the rest of the world. We're chosen by God. Now remember, in Calvinism, this is built upon the idea of predestination. To be godly is to be among the chosen. So if you're here in Calvinist New England, there's a sense of chosenness about your vocation. You're here doing because God has specifically selected you to be among this community of saints. Now, this idea would spread with the colonies as the Puritan settlers of New England, their subsequent generations, fanned out into the Midwest and then into the West in places like California. And this idea was taken with them. Now, in its puritanical form, the city on a hill philosophy was about America's uniqueness as a place blessed by God. But in time, as America became more secular, that idea would evolve. And it became less about a special religious status and more about the exceptional nature of the United States governing institutions, the American character, our way of life, which are all kind of assumed to be superior by most Americans. This concept today is frequently called American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is a unique and even morally superior place for historical, ideological, societal, or religious reasons. Now, we may certainly no longer share Calvin's utopian vision, but we retain a fundamental kernel of that idea. The United States as a special place, a beacon, a bastion of freedom, the world's last best hope, a chosen people. And whether or not that's true, the issue is what I'm saying is that we frame it in Calvinist terms. We frame that idea in terms kind of inherited from this Reformation idea that our Puritan ancestors brought to these shores. Now, another hallmark of Reformation belief is stress on the individual believer's relationship with God. Now, Catholicism views salvation in a very corporate sense. We are saved by being incorporated into a community, the church. It is the church that mediates God's grace to us through the sacraments, the liturgy, the prayers. Even the faith itself is conceived as something gifted to us by the church. If you've been to a baptism recently, you might remember the words of baptism where the celebrant will ask, will say to the parents or godparents, "What do you ask of God's church?" And you say, "Faith." Because we conceive even the faith itself as something that's a gift from the church to us. It's not something we come to on our own, alone, apart from the church. So the church is indispensable in Catholicism. The 3rd century father, St. Cyprian of Carthage, famously said, he cannot have God for his father who does not have the church for his mother. Now, Protestantism, of course, rejected this concept entirely. The Protestant reformers all sought to fashion religion in a very individualist way that dethroned the church from its place as the mediator of salvation. Now, most Protestants, therefore, would argue that the church isn't a visible entity, but that it's invisible. It's just a community of believers that's purely spiritual. I had Protestants in my extended family, and it always was like kind of jarring to me as a Catholic how they'd just be like, I'm not going to church this Sunday, I just don't feel like it. And as a Catholic, it's like the idea of just not going to church, at least if you're a practicing Catholic, I should say, because there's a lot of Catholics who don't go to church. But as a practicing Catholic, that's kind of like an idea that it's hard to wrap my head around. Just, I don't need to go to church. That's just kind of a place I go to if I need an uplifting message or something, you know? So whether someone belonged to the church was no longer a matter of canon law or any empirical evidence, right? But it's a spiritual matter known to God alone. If you were to ask a Catholic, hey, how do you prove you're Catholic? They'd be like, I have this paper that's stamped by the parish. Here's my baptism certificate. But in Protestantism, it's going to be, if you ask, how do I know you're a Christian? It's going to be something more spiritual, like I believe in this and I confess Jesus Christ. And it's not going to be an empirical reality. It's something known to God alone. Now, when Martin Luther left the Catholic Church and formulated his theory of salvation, he stressed heavily the individual's direct and personal access to God. Now, of course, we have a direct personal access to God as Catholics. I don't want you to walk away thinking I'm saying we don't. It's just that in Catholicism, that direct access is like facilitated by the church, whereas in Protestantism, it's not. But at any rate, Protestantism replaces the church with a personal relationship with Jesus. This emphasis is absolutely central in Protestantism, and it still exists today, right? If there's one thing we know about Protestants, it's like they like to come up and ask you, do you have a personal relationship with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ? Like, that's a very central aspect of Protestantism. Now, this individualism extends to how they read the Bible as well. Protestants have an idea called private interpretation, which means that any authoritative interpretation of the Bible is rejected. Every believer needs to read the Bible for themselves and interpret it the best they can, using reason guided by prayer. And this, of course, yields a multitude of interpretations. So in Protestantism, whether we're talking about faith, doctrine, salvation, these are all very individual responsibilities. So the Protestant believer is saved as an individual, not as part of a community, which, by the way, is completely novel in the history of religion. Not just Christianity, but if you go back to any religion, to the ancient world, to paganism, the idea that religion was just one's private individual affair, you can't, you'd be very hard-pressed to find that anywhere in human civilization back to the beginning of time. So the Protestants who settled this country came with an individualist outlook on life, which subsequently got intensified when coupled with the demands of settling the frontier, which demands a sort of self-sufficiency, right? Or perhaps it's the other way around. Perhaps the self-reliance, the rigors of the frontier drew the people who were already the most individualist. Either way, the frontier experience reinforced the individualism of America's Protestant settlers. And people today speak of this as American individualism. Few ideals are held so deeply in the American psyche as this one. The idea that every man is his own master, that our fates are entirely in our own hands, and that one can become anything if he just applies himself. We tend to nurture a sneaking suspicion that the person who's down on their luck is probably responsible for it themselves, and that the rich man's wealth is likely the result of just good old honest work. Our default, I think, is to view societal relations through a lens of individualism, sometimes to a degree that blinds us to systemic structural problems that go beyond individuals. So here's an example. We have this naive belief that we can fix all our political problems if we just get the right people into office, right? How has that been working? It has never, ever worked, right? Now, here's a question. Is every single politician, I've been watching the political ads I mean, not by my will, they just play before I can watch my videos. But, they're always like, so-and-so is corrupt, so-and-so is, they're just constantly bashing everybody. And I know that's partisan politics. But here's what I'm asking. Is every single politician really like an corrupt opportunist who betrays his or her constituents the second they get into office? And that just happens forever? Or is the problem rather that our faith in the power of individuals is causing us to focus our attention in the wrong place? Let's say you had a friend who was complaining about her dating life, and she says, oh my gosh, the last 15 men in a row I've dated have all been duds. And you'd start to think, 15 in a row? Maybe the problem isn't with the men you're dating. Maybe the problem is somewhere else, right? Maybe the problem is not the politicians, but our misplaced faith in the power of the individual to the neglect of the systems those individuals operate within. I was a politician once. I was the mayor of Howell, Michigan for 4 years. And I was very disheartened by how little I could actually do once I got in there. I was like, oh, I see. I can't do anything. And then I just kind of like cut ribbons and hit my little gavel and did that for 4 years and then moved on. There's very little that individuals can do sometimes. And maybe we get blinded to that because we have this faith in the power of one visionary person to just change everything. I'm not saying they can't sometimes, but I'm saying that might not always be the answer. And I think we inherit this from a very individualistic outlook on life that we get from Protestantism. So, an interesting question in Protestantism, at least amongst the Calvinist strains of it, is how do we know that we are saved? I mentioned predestination a little earlier. Remember, in Calvinism, to be saved is to be among the chosen. That is the predestined. But how do you know you're predestined? If you're Calvinist and you're told like God predestines you to heaven or hell from all eternity, obviously I'd like to know this information, right? How do I know this information? So in Calvinism, pious works are not instrumental in attaining our salvation. If you're a Catholic and you want to know how you're saved, it's like, okay, I make effort, I pray, I go to church, I receive the sacraments devoutly, I work on my spiritual life, I go to confession, I hear what the priest has to tell me, I try to do, I do better, and with God's grace, we muddle through, and then, we obviously aren't perfect, but God makes up the difference, and then we can have confidence that we're on the right path. That's one of the most consoling things about being Catholic. But if you're Calvinist, that's just, if God's predestined you from before you existed, and that's that. So good works aren't instrumental in your salvation, but they are taken to be evidence of it. So doing good works does not make us saved, but those who are saved do good things. So in Catholicism, the Catholic who feels a deeper call, we've always had the option to go into religious life or priesthood through the evangelical councils. But that doesn't exist in Calvinism. No Protestant sect has religious life, right? They don't have religious brothers, religious sisters. So for the Calvinists, the only field you can demonstrate your piety and commitment to good deeds is in the secular sphere, because there's no religious sphere. That is through the world of work. Calvinism elevated industriousness as a sign of God's favor. Hard work is a unique sign of God's election. Some of you might be familiar with the German sociologist Max Weber, who called this the Protestant work ethic. Now, this has bequeathed to Americans a very distinctively commercial focus. The United States has never been known as a bastion of high art or deep philosophy, but it has been known as a place of intense commercial activity and practical innovation. There's a reason why Americans have led the world in technological innovations over the past 200 years. 2 centuries after the Puritans first came here, the French writer Alexis de Tocqueville made the following observation about Americans in the 1830s. So this is during the Andrew Jackson presidency. He's talking about the American character. He says, quote, "Their strictly puritanical origin, their exclusively commercial habits, even the country they inhabit, which seems to divert their minds from the pursuit of science, literature, and the arts, have singularly concurred to fix the mind of the American purely upon practical objects. His passions, his wants, his education, everything about him seems to unite in drawing the peoples of the United States earthward. His religion alone bids him turn from time to time a transient, distracted glance towards heaven. Boy, that could have been written today, that we only sometimes turn a transient, distracted glance towards heaven. So did you notice, though, at the outset, he attributes this to our puritanical origin? This, what we could call the commitment to the grind. You got to grind, son. You got to put in the elbow grease. This is an integral part of our psyche. We attach a lot of value to the man who has proven himself by the sweat of his brow. Here's a nice quote from the mid-20th century paleoconservative author Frank Chodorov. And he's talking about how this plays into our political view of candidates. He says, quote, "There was a time in the United States when a candidate for public office could qualify with the electorate only by fixing his birthplace in or near a log cabin. He might have acquired competence or even a fortune since then, but it was in this tradition that he must have been born of poor parents and made his way up the ladder by sheer ability, self-reliance, and perseverance in the face of hardship. In short, he had to be self-made." The so-called Protestant ethic then prevalent held that a man was sturdy and a responsible individual, responsible to himself, his society, and his God. Anyone who could not measure up to that standard could not qualify for public office or even popular respect. One who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth might be envied, but he could not aspire to public acclaim. He had to live out his life in the seclusion of his own class, end quote. We see this today, like during the election. If you ever see the president, any president, they're always impeccably dressed in a suit and tie, right, when they're doing official stuff. But how are they dressed when they're campaigning in the commercial? They've got like a work shirt on with their sleeves rolled up, right? And they've got jeans on, and they're wearing a factory helmet and shaking hands with people because it's necessary to show like, hey, I'm just like you. I've worked my way up to where I am with some hard work, and together we can all work hard and bring this country into a better place. So we still have this sense today, which is now, some of these things you might just be thinking, Philip, this is just common sense stuff. This is just like, duh. But what I'm saying is like, we don't even realize that a lot of these assumptions have been inherited from somewhere. Because if you look at European history, it wasn't always that way. If you look at like a history of the prime ministers of Great Britain, they would just straight up pick like a guy who's just some noble, William Pitt the Younger, and be like, come on in and run the country. And they didn't assume that he had to work himself up from the bottom. They would just kind of pick a noble, be like, you're a general, like Lord Howe or Lord so-and-so. And that guy was expected to have the intellect and the skills that a noble was expected to have, which would be governing, leading the army, etc. But in America, we'd be horrified if a person just came through and said, my quality is that I'm noble and I have a lot of wealth or whatever. We want to believe, even among candidates who are very wealthy, we want to believe he's just like you and me. That's why people like love Elon Musk, because he's like the richest guy in the world, but he comes across as just like the slob that you'd meet at the bar, And people are endeared by that in America because we want to believe like that guy, we can all just work ourselves up the ladder, So to be an American, one must have a commitment to the grind. The grind is the preferred way to get ahead. It's the preferred way to get ahead. If you ask a rich person, how did you get your money? We want to hear, well, sir, I started in my father's garage when I was 15. And we want to hear that story. We don't want to hear, I inherited it from my great-grandpa's oil business. Like, that's not as impressive. We want to hear the self-made man narrative. So we have a profoundly commercialist view of our identity and our place in the world because of this. There's a famous quote from President Calvin Coolidge, who, interestingly enough, was a Calvinist and literally named after John Calvin. Calvin Coolidge said, quote, "The chief business of the American people is business. They are profoundly concerned with producing, buying, selling, investing, and prospering in the world," end quote. So it's like a pragmatic commercialism, the emphasis on prosperity, to ever bigger returns, unchecked expansion, commitment to the grind. This is the character that we have imbibed from the old Calvinist notion that industriousness and financial success are signs of God's favor. except now instead of saying God's favor, we just say these are the signs of a good man or a good person. Now, it should be mentioned, do you guys know what the prosperity gospel movement is? This is like a movement in Protestantism where they teach that God wants us all to be wealthy and physically healthy all the time and blessed. And if you're poor, it's because you don't have enough faith, basically. Like you just believe hard enough. I read a historian, Kate Bowler, who pointed out that this is a uniquely American theology. I mean, it's spread to other parts of the world now, but it came out of America. She called it, quote, an American gospel of pragmatism, individualism, and upward mobility. Now, even among Americans who no longer even believe in God, it's difficult to shake the traditional mantra that there's no hole you can't dig yourself out of with enough work, that a good man should always be able to pull himself up by his bootstraps. Now, again, I'm not saying that there's not situations where that isn't true. We've probably, all of us, had situations where we got out of something because we worked really, really hard at it. What I'm saying is that's the default view that's like the glasses that we put on when we look at all of society. And it's something we inherit from the Calvinist work ethic. Now, speaking of commercialism, the United States is obviously a very wealthy nation. We've benefited, not me though, but I mean, the United States as a whole is very wealthy. We've benefited tremendously from this commercialism. We've had a historically growing population, an abundance of natural resources. And we see here another influence of Protestantism when it comes to the question of who should be the beneficiaries of that largesse. Who is the beneficiaries of that? Now, Catholicism, as it doesn't have any equivalent to the Calvinist take on predestination, all of us are therefore works in progress, right? We are all simultaneously saints and sinners. We are not the church of the perfect, as Pope Francis is keen on reminding us, but we are all pilgrims on a journey towards God. And even those who have passed on into death can still use our prayers, right? We pray for those in purgatory. The souls in heaven pray for us because we're all in need. There's a spiritual generosity to how we think of one another. And this extends to the compassion we show our neighbor in Catholicism. The corporal and spiritual works of mercy direct us to show charity to all in need, whether spiritual need or physical need. And this is borne out by the Catholic Church's vast network of charities and hospitals, which is the biggest non-governmental network of healthcare on the planet. We should be proud of that. Because our struggle is so universal, our compassion must be as well. And this comes back to Jesus's redemption. Christ died for every single one of us. He paid for your sins just as well as mine. It didn't matter where you were born, who your daddy is, how much money he made, right? Every single one of us, he paid for our sins. So by what right can I hold back any generosity from you if the Son of God died on the cross for me? That's great stuff. I'm glad to be Catholic. But as we move to Calvinist theology, we come across a concept called limited atonement. Now, we've discussed how Calvinism maintains a rigid distinction between saints and sinners based on predestination. The saints are the chosen, the elect, who are absolutely saved because God has predestined them to salvation. The sinners are those whom Christ has predestined to hell. So limited atonement means that Jesus only died for the elect. Why would he die for those predestined to hell? If he died for those people, they wouldn't be predestined to hell. They'd go to heaven. So by logical necessity, Jesus didn't die for those people. If he did, they wouldn't be reprobate. So for the Calvinists, Christ didn't die for everybody. Atonement is limited. Now, Calvinism thus lacks the sort of like spiritual largesse or generosity that you see in Catholicism. We pray for each other because we have the sense that no one is irredeemable. No one is irredeemable. That's why even you some of you probably have children who are away from the faith. You know, you do things like you hide little green scapulars under their mattress. You know, we do weird stuff like that because I've done it too. But, you know, because we believe that no one's irredeemable. And even if you've lived the worst possible life at the last glimmer of your earthly life, if you call out to Christ and Mary and say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, he will. Amen. That's great. But in Calvinism, a huge swath of humanity is literally irredeemable. Like there's no point in praying for them. There's no point in sacrificing for them. They've been predestined to hell. They're not among the elect. Christ did not die for them. They are literally unworthy. Now remember, in Calvinism, the only way to be sure that you are among the elect is to work hard and demonstrate your election. We talked in the last section about what that means for those who do work hard. But what does it mean for those who don't work hard, who aren't industrious, who've messed up and made mistakes? It means they're not among the elect, and therefore they don't merit that compassion or that spiritual generosity. They are the unworthy. And so in the United States, we've maintained this concept that I call the worthy as the beneficiaries of public good. And I picked up this phrase from a YouTuber whose name escapes me. So this recording will be on the internet afterwards. YouTuber, if you hear this, I'm sorry. I'm crediting you, but I can't remember your name or your channel. Whoever you are, sir. The worthy as the beneficiaries of public good. So maybe we've struggled with this as Catholics. I know I have. We have an internal tension in how we view charity and public assistance. Assistance is supposed to be reserved for those who have no other recourse, right? But at the same time, we want to feel like they deserve it, right? Now, charity is, by definition, something no one has a claim to in justice, right? I'll say that again. Charity means you have no claim to it in justice. But we still want to feel like, in some sense, the recipient has earned it, right? Either by showing that he's trying, that he's living a clean life, or at very least that he's thankful. It's as if we want to say to the needy, prove that you are worthy. Now, even in the old days in medieval Christendom, people were hesitant to give charity to people who were just straight up drunks or cheats. But there was a different attitude towards charity. People gave to the poor not because they were worthy, but just because they were there, just because they existed. And the poor were part of this economy of salvation too. They would give to the poor and say, pray for me. And the poor person, if he could do nothing else, he could say, God bless you, sir. And that was considered something of value. The act of giving in Catholicism has traditionally been about the giver, the one who's giving the charity. It's not about the guy who asks. It's about the one performing the work of charity for the good of his soul. So when Jesus told the rich man, sell all you have and give to the poor and follow me, what was the next line? What's the next line? You will have treasure in heaven. Who's that addressed to? That's addressed to the giver. Give to the poor, follow me, and you will have treasure in heaven. He did not say, sell all you have, give to the poor, follow me, then we will have reduced hunger in the county by 2.9%. Now, maybe that's a byproduct of the giving, but the point is the reason that Jesus told us to give wasn't because of that's how we were going to tackle the problem of poverty in our communities. It was about making us detached from wealth, making us detached from materialism so that we would be better people, so that our souls would be more conformed to his. And that would have a very salutary side effect that if we all went around living and thinking and acting that way, we would, as a kind of bonus, end up helping the poor, right? But that's where it started. Jesus wanted it to be a personal action, not something that we kind of like ship off to the government, and then it's not personal, and then we kind of lose that compassion that we're supposed to have for the person in need. And then we start thinking of them as just parasites because they're taking my tax dollars, right? So the way we see it, it's more about the disposition of the recipient. We are vastly more focused on making sure the poor deserve our help, making sure they're not taking advantage of the system, accountability, making sure our aid to them is not wasted, making sure they're on the hook somehow. If you're receiving a public benefit, there's always going to be some kind of quid pro quo, a scrutiny, an oversight to make sure they are properly eligible. Those of you who have kids in college, you might, some colleges like Steubenville, Hillsdale, they don't accept any government money for student aid. Why not? Because if the government gives you this largesse, you're on the hook. You have to teach what they want to teach. You have to have certain requirements met. You have to toe the government line, because the charity isn't about actually helping people accomplish their goals. It's about making sure that a certain line is being towed, certain ideas are being pushed, and that we're getting what we want out of the recipient. It's a quid pro quo. And that's simply the way that we view charitable assistance in this country, whether it's our own personal giving or whether it's the government giving. We want to make sure the guy we're giving the $10 to isn't going to buy booze with it. He is, but, I'm just saying. A long time ago, I came to the conclusion that that was between him and God, whatever you're going to do with it. It's about me, not that guy ultimately, if I can. But, everybody has to find their own conscience on this matter. My point is to stress how this kind of ties back to this idea of worthiness and being able to receive the benefits of our largesse. So I'm not suggesting that this is a bad thing to want to make sure your charity is well placed. That's obviously not a terrible thing. But to point out that this attitude is an evolution of the Calvinist view of the worthy as being the beneficiaries of our good. Now, we must also consider the place the state plays in Reformation society. I was just mentioning the government and the demands the government makes. Reformation denominations, all very different. Lutherans believe very different from Presbyterians versus Anglicans and so on. But there's one thing that they all have in common, which was the state takeover of churches and church properties. The Reformers did not believe it was fitting for the church to own temporal possessions. And so the state was the proper custodian of the church's well-being. Essentially, what happened at the Reformation was the nationalization of churches. Everywhere the Reformation took root, we see the confiscation of church properties to be managed by the government. And then the ministers of the denomination become government employees, as they still are in England to this day, and in a different way in Germany. Now, once the churches were in government hands, Reformation principles could be implemented by force of law. Because once you've eliminated the allegiance to like a supranational church that has a pope in Rome, once you've got rid of that, and the government's in control of church property, the Protestant churches necessarily morphed into nationalist entities. Has anybody ever been to England? Have you visited some of the churches in England? Oh, you didn't? Well, that's too bad. They're nice. But it's kind of surreal, because when you go into some of the English churches, they are filled with dead bodies everywhere. Every single space is filled with a tomb. And they're not tombs of religious people. I mean, some of them are. There's like bishops and whatnot. But the vast majority of them, when you look at them, they're lawyers, military officers, governors, people who serve, members of parliament, judges. It's all civic officials. And it's very odd, because as a Catholic, you're used to like holy people are buried in the saints, monks, and it's all like it's lawyers and judges, right? So this is because Anglicanism was essentially the official religion of the British Empire. It was like a nationalist church that was kind of co-opted to be the patriotic church of the British Empire. And if you visit England, you'll see the churches functioned as patriotic temples to the glory of the British state. It's like the nationalization of religion. Now, this led in these countries to the emergence of patriotic rituals that were modeled loosely on traditional religious rites. Because ritual is really great. This is something every Catholic knows. Ritual is great. It binds people together. It helps instill values. It evokes feelings of devotion. It speaks to us on a symbolic level. And that can be very helpful if you want to promote national unity in the secular sphere. So what we see is that while Protestant governments abolished Catholic rituals in worship, they took a lot of those rituals and they reintroduced them in the back door of civic life. And this was especially true in the democratic era. The United States, as I mentioned, was the first democracy in the modern age, and the founders of this country were looking for a way to solidify a sense of unity in this new people. So governments were looking for a new national symbolism, whether France or United States. So what they did was, we see the emergence of a civic religion that replaced the ritual symbols of Catholicism and redirects them toward the state. Does anybody know what civic religion means, what that phrase means? Idea? So civic religion is like a nation's implicit values that are expressed through public symbols, beliefs, and rituals. And what I'm saying is that in these countries, these rituals were all borrowed from Catholicism because of the great historic power of Catholic ritual to bind people together. So listen to this, and maybe you've thought about some of this before, but I'm going to put it in a list so we can get the big picture. In our civic religion, the Constitution would be like the Bible. It's an authoritative document, and it's held by many even to be perfect and an inspired document by some Protestants. The Pledge of Allegiance is like a creed, right? The creed is what we profess every week in church. The pledge is like a creed professed to the symbol of the Republic. The flag assumes the role of the cross as an object of devotion and a sign of political salvation. If you look at paintings of Catholic martyrdom, the saint is always like clutching the cross. If you look at paintings of American wars, the heroes are clutching the flag. It operates in the same sense as a symbol. The founding fathers are like the church fathers. The U.S. has its own secular saints. If you drive to any small town around the country, there's going to be statues of some secular figure, a Civil War veteran, the guy who founded the town, right? These are like the secular saints who are venerated in 1,000 town squares around the country. Our devotion to our fallen military heroes imitates the cult of the martyrs. The civil holidays replace holy days. Veterans Day and Memorial Day are analogous to All Saints Day and All Souls Day. Patriotic songs replace hymns, sometimes to the degree that they are literally sung as hymns in church services. Civic parades like the 4th of July and Memorial Day, they replace religious processions, right? Because religious processions were the first parades. And then in the Democratic era, they said, let's just do that, but without the religion. Patriotism is the virtue that replaces charity to bind the state together. And we have our own monuments and holy places to which we pilgrimage to venerate the sites associated with our country's salvation history, like Gettysburg Battlefield, the Lincoln Memorial, which, by the way, is built to look like a temple with Lincoln seated in repose in it like a Greek god, or Mount Rushmore, which is incidentally known as the Shrine of Democracy. Has anybody ever seen the original Washington Monument before they built the obelisk? You know, this one was the second Washington Monument we had. Has anybody ever heard this? So you probably know our founding fathers were very enamored with like Greco-Roman sort of themes and artistic motifs. When they first put out the contract to design the Washington Monument, it went to an artist who created an image of Washington seated in like a, kind of like in a throne, wearing a toga, muscular, the toga is like coming down. You can see his breast is exposed. He's like a Greek god. And the people in charge of the monument said, no, that's going too far. We're not going to make Washington look like Hercules. And this statue still exists. It's in some building in Washington or Maryland somewhere. You can go see it if you want to look at. I can't remember the name of it, but look up the original Washington Monument, and it's this bizarre statue of George Washington in the figure of like Jupiter seated on a throne with a toga. And then later they went for the obelisk instead. Which, by the way, if you go to the Washington Monument, you will notice that the bricks are two different colors on the monument. Like 2/3 of the way up, it switches from one color to another. This is because to build the monument, they were soliciting donations of the granite, I think, from all the different states and even different countries. And the Vatican, Pope Pius IX, or not Pius, maybe it was, one of the earlier popes than that, but they donated a bunch of like very nice Italian stone. And this alarmed the anti-Catholic factions in Washington, D.C., the know-nothings, and they hijacked the stone shipment and dumped it into the Potomac River. And then they protested the whole. They ended up taking over the committee that was in charge of the monument, and then it became like a total just boondoggle, and the monument went uncompleted for a whole generation. The Civil War happened, and it just sat there, half completion. And then they finished it afterwards, but by that time, it had been a whole generation. They couldn't get access to the original stone anymore, and they finished it with a different quality of stone that subsequently is a different color. So the reason the Washington Monument is two colors is because an anti-Catholic group dumped the original marble into the Potomac. Fun stuff. Okay, so back to the civic religion. I'm not saying this stuff is bad by any means. I'm not saying like 4th of July parades or, God forbid, Memorial Day are bad things. No, certainly not. But I'm pointing out that they exist specifically because of our government's attempt to reintroduce ceremony into public life after it was systematically removed from ecclesiastical life during the Reformation as a function of culturally Protestant nations leveraging historically Christian imagery for patriotic purposes. Ceremony was banished from the churches, translated to the state, and then redirected towards secular ends. This is the origin of our civic religion. It exists, we could say, to fill a cultural gap that was left when Catholicism was vacuumed out of public life. Now, the final point I'm going to bring up, and I save this one till the end because I think we're all familiar with this one. Our final inheritance of the Reformation is what I call the dirty Spaniard. This is our generally negative assessment of Spain and Spaniards in our historical memory. Historians speak of something called the Black Legend. This is an attitude we have towards Spaniards where we believe them to be especially violent, cruel, malicious, greedy. We no longer have any beef with Spain politically these days, but we have an inherited cultural memory of Spaniards as mustache-twirling villains. Anybody have Spanish ancestry in here? Or married a Spaniard? Or no? Okay. Last time I gave this talk, there were several people in the crowd who were, and I was like, watch out for that guy. No, I'm just kidding. Now, we have this cultural memory of the Spaniards as like these greedy, avaricious, cruel villains. During the Reformation, Spain was the most powerful Catholic kingdom. Now, Spain got involved with a prolonged war against England in the 1500s, and as the Spaniards geared up for war with England by furnishing the Spanish Armada to invade the island, the English responded by waging a campaign of propaganda against Spain. We've seen this in our own country during wartime, where we whip up propaganda against the opposing nation to stir up the zeal of our people to support the war effort. The English propaganda at this period was exceptionally well done. It's still doing its job 500 years later. They attempted to discredit Spain internationally while whipping up an anti-Spanish frenzy at home. The propaganda accused the Spaniards of all manner of cruelty, from feeding babies to dogs to all kinds of awful atrocities. Historian Edward Murray Peters observes how successful this propaganda campaign was. He says, quote, "An image of Spain circulated through late 16th century Europe, born by means of political and religious propaganda that blackened the character of Spaniards and their ruler to such an extent that Spain became the symbol of all forces of repression, brutality, religious and political intolerance, intellectual and artistic backwardness for the next 4 centuries. This black legend associates Spain with the Inquisition, religious bigotry, persecution, torture, despotic monarchs. And this view of the Spaniard passed into English society and endured long after that war was over. It's the source of many of the untruths that people believe about the Spanish Inquisition, for example, with its fantastical torture devices that never really existed, but were inventions of Victorian-era British novelists who wrote those horrible torture devices into their stories precisely because they knew that English people would believe them. The United States, as an Anglo enterprise, adopted these biases as well. Have you ever noticed how Spanish explorers are vilified as gold seekers and conquistadors, but the English who came here with the exact same motives get to be called colonists? The Spaniards are the evil conquerors. The English are the peaceful, noble-minded settlers. Okay, let me ask you a question. Why is the population of Native Americans in South America today 58 million, when in North America it's 9 million? Something happened back then. If you were a Native American, you were vastly better off to have a Spaniard land on your shore than an Englishman. The Spaniards intermarried with the natives. They conquered them, but they conquered them as subjects, not as savages to be exterminated. They said, okay, we're in control now. Instead of giving gold to your emperor, you're going to give it to me. And you're still going to live in your villages. You're going to stay on your land, but we're in charge. And they built a society around that. And that's why, most of the people in Latin America are mestizo, which is a mix between European and native. So like I said, you were vastly better off to have a Spaniard land on your shore than an Englishman. Now, some historians argue that the Black Legend continued to affect relations between the U.S. and Latin America into modern times. Those of you who know the history of the Spanish-American War of 1898, a magazine explosion caused the destruction of the USS Maine in the Spanish-controlled harbor of Havana in 1898. And the American press immediately accused the Spaniards of deliberately blowing up the ship, even though we were at peace with them. They said that the Spaniards laid a naval mine and destroyed the ship. Spain protested innocence, but they were ignored. The U.S. declared war on Spain, seized Cuba, the Philippines, and ended Spain's 400-year tenure in the New World. That's how we got like American Samoa and Guam and Puerto Rico and all those places. Now, subsequent investigations after the war confirmed the Spaniards' story that it was an accidental magazine explosion, not a naval mine. Findings the American government finally did accept and agree to years after the U.S. obligingly relieved Spain of all its American territories. So the Spaniard thus forms a villainous foil against which to contrast a specifically American way of life. American historian Richard Kagan argued that historically, quote, the promoters of American exceptionalism found it useful to see Spain as an example of what would happen to a country whose fundamental values were antithetical to the United States, end quote. Even to this day, most of you would probably implicitly believe any awful story I told you if I located it in a Latin American setting. You would, I know. I tried this on my daughter. I was like, oh my gosh, did you hear in Honduras? They're going on the street and they're knocking people out, and then they wake up and their arms are gone. And she's like, oh my gosh, I'd believe that, you know? And I just make up a crazy story and say it happened in Caracas or somewhere, and it's like implicitly believed because we all have this idea that in Latin America, people are horrible and things are awful down there. Hopefully not all of us think that, but cultural bias is nothing new. It's nothing unique. This has been going on as, you know, in human history, every part of the world. I met a Vietnamese lady a few years ago, and boy, she gave me an earful of what she thought of the Chinese, you know. Bias is everywhere, right? But I'm saying this particular bias is a direct consequence of the antagonisms of the Reformation, when Catholic Spain threatened the Protestant power of England, and this bias has endured in England and was translated to the United States. So to wrap this up, these were just the ones I could think of. I'm sure there are probably more if I thought on this a bit longer, but I think you get the point. At the outset, I said that ideas don't emerge from a vacuum. They have family trees, just like people have family trees. So the purpose of pointing this stuff out is so we can be more reflective about the assumptions we're bringing to the issues of our own day. We often carry beliefs and attitudes that we believe are simply facts of life, right? I go back to that 12-year-old boy carrying the alcohol in Austria, and I wonder if he could conceive of a reality where he wasn't allowed to go buy the alcohol and bring it home. Just like I had a hard time envisioning that he could do that. For him, just that alcohol was a part of life, right? And he probably wouldn't have realized that that's just, you know, something that he grew up with. So for us, a lot of these attitudes I've pointed out are just as self-evident as the blueness of the sky. We may not realize that these attitudes are actually part of a cultural inheritance, that they're shaped by the struggles, ideologies, and prejudices of previous ages. And that doesn't mean they're bad or invalid, as I've said multiple times. So I don't want people to think I'm just dunking on American culture, because I'm not. I'm pointing out that we should recognize them so that we can understand our own thinking better, right? Get a broader view of the challenges that we face as a society. It's very hard to step outside. One thing I've learned from studying history, it's very hard to step outside your own zeitgeist, your own times, and to objectively look at what's going on, right? Have you ever looked at like things from, I don't know, the 1960s or the 1920s? Like when the whole country was like, let's ban beer. Like, have you ever thought about that and been like, what was going through their head when they did that? Or you just think of these different things. You read accounts of like slavery, and you're like, how did people like every day say that was acceptable? Or you look at like, you know, hippies, and you're like, what? Like, why were they doing that? Like, it was cool. Yeah, it was cool. Yes. Just like when I look at my own kids or young kids, and they're dyeing their hair all these different ways and doing things. I'm like, why are you doing? And it's cool, Dad, But it's very hard to step outside like the stream of your own generation and kind of step back and take a bigger picture. So every generation has done it. I've done it. Back when I had a green mohawk, I was doing it. Me losing my hair is punishment for that, by the way. Okay, so we want to get a broader view of the challenges we face as a society and make more reflective decisions. Because remember, so we're talking about how ideas that were current in like 1580 are having like residual impact today. The ideas we are circulating today are going to be the cultural inheritance of future generations for how many years down the road. Are people is this talk going to be happening in the year 2530, saying like, oh, this is an early 21st century American bias that we're still grappling with? Who knows? We got to think about that, though, and try to be more self-reflective about where some of these ideas come from. So that's it. That's my talk. Thank you for staying awake through it. Appreciate it.